I think he would have been proud.
Dad, do you think Grandpa would have liked how it looks?
Mr. Miller, seize the wagon.
Dad, what is happening?
Come with us, right now! Mr. Miller, you have to come with us, right now!
I'm sorry, Mr. Miller.
This is the Founder's Mark.
Dad, that's ours. We've been looking for it for—
Your family didn't inherit this wagon.
Your family protected it. Who were you really?
The day Eleanor Whitmore had my wagon seized, I thought I was losing the last piece of my family's history. 10 minutes later, the entire town council was begging me to speak with her. It happened during the annual Heritage Festival. Every year, ranchers, historians, and families from across Texas gathered to celebrate the history of our region. For most people, it was a festival. For Emma, it was Christmas. She had spent weeks preparing our wagon, not because it was valuable, not because anyone had asked us to, because she loved its story. The wagon had belonged to my grandfather. At least that's what my father always believed. For years, I had restored it one piece at a time. New wood where necessary, original iron wherever possible. Every scratch, every repair, every inch of that wagon carried a memory. Emma understood that, maybe better than I did. As we approached the town square that morning, she smiled. "Dad, you think Grandpa would have liked how it looks now?" I looked at the polished wood catching the morning sunlight. "I think he would have been proud." She smiled. That alone made the entire trip worth it. The festival grounds were already crowded. Children ran between food stalls, musicians played near the courthouse, historians examined antique equipment and old photographs. Then I noticed something unusual. More security than normal, more officials, more people wearing expensive suits, and standing near the center of the square was Eleanor Whitmore. Everyone in Texas knew Eleanor, owner of the largest ranch in the region, sponsor of the Heritage Festival, daughter of one of the most respected ranching families in the state. She stood beside several members of the town council, lawyers, historians, business leaders. I didn't think much of it. Emma and I parked the wagon in the historical exhibition area. Within minutes, people gathered around it. Some remembered seeing it years earlier. Others complimented the restoration. Emma proudly explained every detail to anyone willing to listen. Then everything changed. A woman wearing white archival gloves stepped closer to the wagon. She examined one of the wooden side panels, then another. She whispered something to Eleanor. I watched Eleanor's expression change. Confusion, then surprise, then something else. Fear. She walked toward us, not quickly, carefully, as if every step mattered. "Mr. Miller?" "Yes." She looked at the wagon, then back at me. "Who restored this?" "I did." She nodded slowly. Then she said 4 words that made the entire festival stop. "Seize the wagon." At first, I honestly thought I had misunderstood. So did everyone else. Then several officials stepped forward. Emma grabbed my hand. "Dad?" The crowd began shouting. People protested. Someone accused Eleanor of abusing her authority. Emma's eyes filled with tears. "But it's ours." I looked at Eleanor. There had to be a mistake. There must be some misunderstanding. She didn't answer. Not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't. For the first time since I had met her, Eleanor Whitmore looked genuinely terrified. The wagon was pulled away. Emma started crying, and I stood there watching the only family heirloom I had left disappear down the street. Then exactly 10 minutes later, everything changed. 3 members of the town council ran back toward me, not angry, not confident, terrified. One of them grabbed my arm. "Mr. Miller." His voice shook. "You have to come speak to Eleanor. Right now." And in that moment I realized something. They hadn't taken my wagon because it was worthless. They had taken it because they had just discovered what it really was. My name is Jacob Miller. I'm 42 years old. I'm a cowboy, a father, a widower, and until Eleanor Whitmore ordered my wagon seized, I believed I understood exactly how the world worked. Sometimes people disappoint you. Sometimes life is unfair. And sometimes the only thing you can do is keep moving forward. I live on a small ranch outside town with my daughter, Emma. Calling it a ranch is probably generous. We have a few horses, some cattle, a barn that's older than both of us combined, and a workshop that's held together by hard work, stubbornness, and repairs layered over repairs. Money has never stayed long in our house. Most months, we earn enough. Some months, we don't. But Emma has never cared about any of that. At 8 years old, she's convinced we live in the richest place in Texas. Not because of money, because of stories. Emma loves horses. She always has. But if she loves anything more than horses, it's history. Old photographs, old tools, old maps, old stories, and especially old wagons. When other children watched cartoons, Emma asked me about the people who built the roads, the ranchers who crossed the plains, the families who traveled west with everything they owned packed into wooden wagons. Sometimes I'd catch her sitting in my workshop for hours, simply staring at my grandfather's old wagon. Not because it was beautiful, because she believed every scratch had a story. Maybe she inherited that from Sarah. My wife always believed people judged things too quickly. She used to stop and talk to strangers everyone else ignored. She rescued animals nobody wanted. She repaired furniture people threw away. And whenever I questioned why she spent so much time trying to understand broken things, she'd smile and say something I've never forgotten. Sometimes people do the wrong thing for the right reason. Back then, I thought she was talking about mistakes. Years later, I realized she was talking about people. Because people are complicated. Fear makes good people make bad decisions. Love makes smart people act foolishly. And sometimes the truth hides behind actions that look impossible to understand. After Sarah died, I tried to teach Emma the same lesson. Never judge too quickly. Never assume you know the whole story. Always ask why. That lesson became much harder to remember the day Eleanor Whitmore confiscated our wagon. I should have been angry. Honestly, part of me was. Emma was crying. The crowd was shouting. People accused Eleanor of abusing her power. And for a few seconds, I almost believed them. Then I looked at her face, really looked at it. Not the face of a billionaire, not the face of a businesswoman, not even the face of someone making a decision, the face of someone discovering something terrifying. I've seen that expression before, years ago, during investigations, when witnesses suddenly realized a crime was much bigger than they first believed, when lawmen discovered evidence they wished they hadn't found, when ordinary people accidentally uncovered extraordinary truths. Eleanor wasn't angry. She wasn't arrogant. She wasn't trying to humiliate me. She was afraid. And that frightened me more than losing the wagon itself. Because if Eleanor Whitmore was afraid, then she had discovered something about my grandfather's old wagon that neither Emma nor I had ever imagined. And somehow, deep down, I already knew. Sarah had been right. Once again, someone had done the wrong thing. For a reason I still didn't understand. I spent most of my life believing my grandfather's wagon was valuable for one reason. It was all we had left of him. Not valuable in money, not valuable in history, valuable because it carried memories. My father used to tell me stories about that wagon when I was a boy. How my grandfather repaired it himself. How he used it to transport supplies across Texas. How he refused to sell it, even during the hardest years of his life. After my father died, The wagon became mine. Not officially, emotionally. And over the years, I spent countless hours restoring it. Whenever I could afford new materials, I bought them. Whenever I found original parts, I preserved them. Some repairs took months. Others took years. Emma helped me with most of them. She always believed the wagon was special. I just never imagined how right she was. After the town council practically dragged me into the municipal archives building, I found Eleanor waiting. She still looked shaken, more shaken than I had ever seen her. "I'm sorry," she said before I could speak. "For what?" "For taking your wagon." I wanted to be angry, but the expression on her face stopped me. "What happened?" She looked at me for several seconds. Then she led me into a small room where 3 historians, 2 archivists, and several town officials stood around dozens of photographs and documents. One of the historians approached me immediately. "Mr. Miller?" he asked carefully. "Where exactly did your grandfather acquire that wagon?" I laughed. If I knew that, I probably wouldn't be standing here. Nobody laughed. That worried me. The elderly historian placed several enlarged photographs on the table. One image showed the interior side panel of my wagon, specifically the section Eleanor had examined before ordering it seized. "There," he said. I leaned forward, a symbol, small, nearly invisible, carved into the wood. I had seen it hundreds of times during restoration. I always assumed it was decorative. Apparently, I was wrong. The historian's hands trembled slightly. This symbol disappeared over 100 years ago. I looked at Eleanor, then back at him. "What symbol?" He swallowed. "The founder's mark." I honestly thought he was joking. He wasn't. Over the next hour, they explained everything. More than a century earlier, before the town even existed, the first settlers established a supply caravan system across this region of Texas. Only a handful of official wagons were ever built. Each carried the same hidden mark. Each documented the founding of the settlement. According to every historical record, all of them had been destroyed, all except one. The missing wagon. A wagon historians had spent generations searching for. A wagon that apparently had been sitting in my workshop for years. I stared at the photographs, at the documents, at the maps. It didn't make sense, until they showed me something else. An old photograph, black and white, faded by time. The image showed the founders of the town standing beside a wagon. My wagon, or at least what had become my wagon. Even the damage patterns matched. The iron reinforcements, the wheel design, the carved side panels. Emma would have recognized it immediately. I sat down. For the first time since Eleanor seized the wagon, I finally understood why she had looked terrified. Because if the historians were right, then my grandfather hadn't simply owned an old wagon. He had unknowingly preserved one of the most important historical artifacts in the entire state. The investigation moved quickly. Municipal archives, state records, property registries, newspapers over a century old, every document led to the same conclusion. The wagon was directly connected to the founding of our town, and somehow my family had protected it for generations without ever knowing. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt something else. Because while everyone around me celebrated the discovery, I noticed one detail nobody else seemed to notice. Several historical records had been altered. Pages were missing. Dates had been changed. And someone had gone through considerable effort to hide the wagon's existence. The old instincts I thought I had buried years ago returned immediately. Because historical accidents don't cover their own tracks. People do. And somewhere in Texas, someone had just realized we were getting too close to the truth. The moment I realized someone had altered historical records, I stopped thinking like a rancher and started thinking like a Texas Ranger again. I hadn't done that in years, not since Sarah died, not since I promised myself that my life would revolve around raising Emma instead of chasing criminals. But old instincts don't disappear. They wait. And as I sat in the municipal archives looking at pages that had been intentionally altered, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't an accident. Someone had spent years trying to make sure my family's wagon was never discovered. The first name that came to mind was Victor Kane. Not because I had proof, because I understood motive. Victor owned land throughout the county. He invested in historical properties. He sat on preservation committees. And more importantly, he had spent years fighting Eleanor Whitmore for control over several development projects. If anyone had something to gain from hiding the true history of the town, it was Victor. Eleanor wasn't convinced at first. You really think someone would spend years hiding the existence of a wagon? I looked at the altered records spread across the table. No, I said quietly. I think someone spent years hiding what the wagon could prove. The next few days became an investigation. Not officially, but in every way that mattered. I visited county archives, spoke with retired historians, reviewed land registries, property transfers, museum records, and slowly the pieces began fitting together. The missing documents all shared something in common. They involved land, specifically land surrounding the original settlement area, land that, over the last 15 years, had quietly been purchased by companies connected to Victor Kane. At first, the purchases looked ordinary. Then I started following the money. Shell corporations, hidden partnerships, corporate transfers, old habits. The kind you learn after years of tracking men who believed paperwork could hide the truth. By the end of the week, I had enough evidence to understand what Victor had been doing. For years, he had manipulated historical records to erase the true ownership history of the region. Because if the founder's wagon was ever discovered, it would prove something extraordinary. Several properties Victor claimed to own legally had originally belonged to the founding trust of the town, a trust that had never been dissolved, meaning millions of dollars in land ownership could suddenly be disputed. When I showed Eleanor the evidence, she didn't speak for a long time. Then she asked the question I had been asking myself. How long has he known? I already knew the answer. Too long. Victor had known exactly what the wagon was. He knew before I restored it. He knew before Emma cleaned it. He probably knew before I was even born. And he had spent decades making sure nobody else discovered the truth. But his plan was beginning to fail. The historians had confirmed the wagon's authenticity. The town council had suspended all property reviews. The State Historical Commission was already involved. Victor was losing control, which made him dangerous. That night, I returned to my workshop. The wagon sat exactly where Eleanor had ordered it returned. Emma had already gone to sleep. For a long time, I simply stared at it. The same wagon my grandfather had driven. The same wagon my father had protected. The same wagon I had spent years restoring without ever understanding what it truly was. Then I noticed something. A section of wood near the driver's seat looked different. Not damaged, modified. I grabbed a lantern, a screwdriver, and for the first time in my life I deliberately took apart a section of my grandfather's wagon. Hidden behind the wood panel was a small metal compartment. My hands began to shake. Inside rested a single folded envelope, yellowed, untouched, sealed with wax, and written across the front, in handwriting more than a century old, were the words that changed everything, to whoever finally discovers the truth. The meeting was held 3 days later at the Whitmore Ranch. By then the story had spread across all of Texas. The missing founder's wagon had been discovered. Historical records had been altered, and somehow a struggling cowboy had become the center of the biggest historical controversy the state had seen in decades. When Emma and I arrived, the main hall was already full. Town council members, historians, attorneys, reporters, local ranchers, employees from Whitmore Ranch, even people who had attended the Heritage Festival were there. Everyone wanted answers. Most importantly, everyone wanted to know why Eleanor Whitmore had seized my wagon. For the first time since this all began, I realized she had never been trying to take anything from me. She had been trying to protect it. Eleanor stood beside me as the meeting began. She looked nervous, not because she feared losing, because she feared being misunderstood again. At the opposite end of the room sat Victor Kane. He looked calm, confident, almost amused, the kind of expression powerful men wear when they believe the truth can still be negotiated. I had seen that expression before, many times. The chairman of the town council stood. "Mr. Miller," he looked toward me. "You requested this meeting." I nodded. Then I walked to the front, carrying a single wooden box. Inside were the documents, the original maps, the registry records, the altered archives, and the letter we had discovered hidden inside the wagon. The room became silent. I began with the historical evidence. The historians confirmed the wagon's authenticity, the wood, the metal, the markings, the craftsmanship. Every expert agreed the wagon was real. Then came the land records, the property maps, the altered archives. One by one, the pieces came together, and with every document presented, Victor's confidence became slightly smaller. Then I opened the envelope. The room became so quiet I could hear the wind outside. The handwriting was old, but perfectly preserved. I began reading. If this letter has been found, then the truth has finally survived. Several historians immediately leaned forward. The letter had been written by one of the original founders of the town, the man responsible for documenting the earliest settlement records. He described a terrible winter storm more than a century earlier, a flood, a fire, panic. Several founding families became trapped. Among them was the Whitmore family, and according to the letter, the person who saved them was not a politician, not a wealthy ranch owner, not a sheriff. It was a young wagon driver, a man named Samuel Miller, my ancestor. The room remained silent. I continued reading. Samuel Miller had risked his own life to rescue multiple families during the disaster, including the Whitmores. Afterward, the founders gifted him the official founder's wagon as a symbol of honor and gratitude. They also recorded something else. The wagon was never intended to become private property. It was meant to remain protected by the Miller family until the truth needed to be revealed. I stopped reading. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. For over 100 years, my family had unknowingly protected one of the most important historical artifacts in the state's history. Not because we were wealthy, not because we were powerful, because someone long ago believed we would do the right thing. Then came the final documents, the evidence against Victor Kane, financial records, property transfers, forged historical archives, witness statements, proof that he had spent years manipulating official records, not because he cared about history, because he cared about land, millions of dollars worth of land. Everything he had built depended on nobody ever discovering the truth. For the first time that day, Victor stood up. He tried to speak. He tried to explain. But there was nothing left to explain. The state investigators who had attended the meeting quietly approached him. The room watched in complete silence as Victor Kane was escorted out. Not as a businessman, not as a rival, as a man who had spent years trying to erase history. When he was gone, the chairman of the council slowly stood. He looked at Eleanor, then at me. The seizure of the wagon is officially declared lawful and necessary for preservation purposes. He smiled. The wagon is also immediately returned to the Miller family. The room erupted into applause. Emma hugged me. For the first time since all this began, Eleanor smiled. Not because she had won, because the truth had. As everyone began leaving, Eleanor approached me. There were tears in her eyes, and for the first time that entire day, she asked me something I never expected. "Jacob, what if this wagon story isn't finished yet?" 2 days after the meeting at Whitmore Ranch, I returned to my workshop. For the first time in weeks, everything was quiet. No lawyers, no historians, no reporters, no investigations. Just me, the wagon, and the sound of Emma singing somewhere outside while feeding the horses. I stood beside the old wagon for a long time, running my hand across the wood my grandfather had touched, the same wood his father had protected, the same wood that had somehow survived more than a century of storms, wars, poverty, and time itself. For most of my life, I believed this wagon belonged to my family. Now I understood something different. My family had never owned it. We had simply protected it. The sound of tires on gravel pulled me from my thoughts. I didn't have to turn around. Somehow I already knew. Eleanor. I smiled before I even saw her. She stepped out of her truck wearing jeans, boots, and the same expression she'd worn the first day she seized my wagon. Not fear this time. Relief. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The setting sun stretched across the fields behind us. Then she walked slowly toward the wagon. She placed her hand gently on the old wood, and finally said the words I think she'd been carrying since the day of the festival. "I didn't seize your wagon to take it from you." I looked at her. "I know." She smiled, a sad smile. "I seized it because I was afraid history would lose it forever." For a second I couldn't speak, because I realized she had been right. If she hadn't acted that day, if she had worried more about being liked than about protecting the truth, the story of my family, the story of her family, the story of our town, could have disappeared forever. I looked at the wagon, then back at Eleanor, and for the first time since all of this began, I wasn't angry about what happened. I was grateful. Before either of us could say anything else, Emma ran toward us. "Dad." Behind her came Noah. The two of them were already arguing about who would become the official wagon guide if there was ever a museum. Emma grabbed Eleanor's hand. Noah climbed into the driver's seat, and within seconds they were laughing as though they had known each other forever. Eleanor watched them. Then she looked at me. "I came here to ask you something." I laughed softly. "That sounds dangerous." She laughed too. Then she became serious. "The town council approved the historical preservation project." I nodded. I'd heard rumors. She took a breath. "We're building a museum." I looked at the wagon, then back at her. "A museum?" She smiled. "A museum for the history of this town. For the founder's wagon. For the families who built everything we have." I remained silent. Then she said the part I never expected. "And I want you to run it." I stared at her. "Me?" She nodded. "Nobody protected this history longer than you did. Even when you didn't know what you were protecting." For the first time in my life, I didn't know what to say. Emma solved that problem. She threw her arms around me. "Dad, we have to do it." Noah agreed immediately. And somehow, standing there beneath the Texas sunset, surrounded by a wagon older than anyone alive, and two children who represented everything still worth protecting, I realized something. Maybe some stories aren't meant to end. Maybe they're meant to be passed on. As the sun disappeared beyond the hills, Emma and Noah ran around the wagon laughing. Eleanor stood beside me, and together we watched history continue. When they seized my wagon, I thought they were taking away my past. What I never imagined was that they were trying to preserve a history much bigger than my own. If someone suddenly took away something that meant everything to you, would you trust them long enough to learn why? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about family, honor, hidden history, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.